Funny. Okay, good. So there's the URLs in case you want to watch. I have about 500 plus C# videos on YouTube if you want to check those out. My goal is to help the community learn C# better. So that's why I'm here. That's what I'm going to do. Just so you know, I am local, which I just found out about this group about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. So I'm like, hey, hi. So we just moved here during the pandemic and didn't really know anybody. And so it's been an uphill climb trying to get back in the groove of living in a new area. So I'll be around probably every month or almost every month if I can. So, but I'm here tonight to talk about modernizing your .NET skills. So who here is a .NET developer? Good, you're in the right place. Okay. So this is very, very informal. If you have questions, shout them out. If you aren't really sure what I'm talking about, say so. If you want me to go deeper into something, I can do that. So I'm gonna go through and kind of hit the high spots of all the stuff that's changed over the years with .NET, especially with a focus on .NET 6 and .NET 7 being a landing point. Of course, .NET 8 is coming, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But for the most part, we're just focusing on what's already here. We're not going to focus on, hey, new stuff, because even though the new stuff is really cool, it's going to change. It's going to change in the next 6 months. It doesn't come out until November. So trying to cover it now, it's not going to be much help to you other than to say, hey, new stuff coming. So with that, we're going to jump right into code. That's all my slides, by the way. So mark it well, because that's it. You only can see it later. But what we're going to do is just jump right into looking at .NET and looking at the differences that have come about. Now, I'm going to cover mostly the changes in the later versions of .NET. So .NET 6 and .NET 7 compared to 5 and before. However, we will touch a little bit upon .NET Framework, which, how many are still in .NET Framework? Okay. A few of you, painful soul, I get it. It's tough to be there. It's tough to see the new stuff and be like, the new kids are having fun, but the people who've been here forever just aren't. But I'm going to cover how to get from .NET Framework to .NET Core and beyond. And we're just going to call this .NET from now on because of the new stuff. Because that's what it's called. .NET 7 is the latest stuff. It's called .NET. And the reason why is because we've gone beyond the numbering scheme of .NET Framework. So if you're not familiar with .NET Framework, we started back in 2001, 2002 era with .NET 1. They call it .NET Framework 1. And they had 1.1 and 2 and all the rest all the way up through. Right now, when Microsoft hit the 4 range, they said, okay, we need to rethink this because we've got about 15, 18 years of kind of back history of changing how the operating system works, changing how the underlying systems work while keeping backward compatibility. The problem with backward compatibility is you've got all these shims and changes and workarounds, and you've seen your own code bases, that after a while the code base gets a little messy. And so they said, hey, we're going to redo this thing, and they built .NET Core. And so they call it .NET Core because they want to rip out all the shims and the workarounds and the patches and try and keep as much compatibility as possible, but at the same time say, hey, we're looking forward, not backwards. And so one of the things was they said, hey, we're going to not rely entirely on Windows, which was all .NET Framework was. It was based in Windows. It was reliant on Windows. It's tied to Windows. If you're not in Windows, you're not using .NET Framework, unless you're doing some really sketchy stuff. So Microsoft said, hey, let's embrace the fact that there's other operating systems out there. We're going to embrace Linux especially, but also Mac. And so they built .NET Core, and they built it alongside the .NET Framework. And at that point, they said, okay, we need to get people over. And so they tried to make it as feature compatible as possible with the language itself. So your C# code in .NET Framework should run in .NET Core almost one-to-one. It's not a different language, it's the same language. It's just the underlying compiler compiles it differently. So there's obviously it's not quite that easy to move. Otherwise, those of y'all on .NET Framework would probably already be on .NET 7. But that's the goal. And from Microsoft's side, that works. Now it's all the third-party libraries and the complexity that comes with the real world that makes it a little more difficult. But what we're going to look at today is .NET 6 and 7. The reason it's called .NET and not .NET Core is because once they got .NET Core 3.1, they said, hey, we have stopped development on .NET Framework at 4.8. That's the last version of .NET Framework that will be supported. And it's still supported. It will be supported. I'm going to quote Microsoft here because it's a grain of salt thing, but it will be supported as long as Windows is supported. So .NET Framework is here to stay, in theory. Now, the reality is when Windows changes, maybe not. And that's not always in the control of developers. But .NET Framework will still be supported, just not updated. The only thing we'll have for updates is security updates. Now, every once in a while, I do sneak in a new feature. So they snuck in a couple of small features into .NET Framework. I believe around WinForms was one of them. Like WinForms high DPI compatible or something else like that in .NET Framework. So you are still sneaking some things in, but basically it's paused at 4.8. But the problem is that .NET Core 3.1, they had a problem because the next major version is .NET Core 4. And we already had a problem of, are you on .NET? Well, yes. What .NET? Well, I'm on .NET 2. No, you're not. You're on .NET Core 2. You're not on .NET Framework 2. That's different. So what they said was, hey, let's skip 4. Let's just not have that confusion. And so there's enough confusion already. Let's just not have that. And so they went to .NET 5. And they said, hey, since we're going to 5 and .NET Framework will never be 5, we can just call it .NET because it's the unified now .NET. And so .NET 5, 6, and 7 are all technically behind the scenes .NET Core. We just don't call them Core anymore. Now, to add to this confusion though, we had ASP.NET. And ASP.NET was .NET Framework. So then they had ASP.NET Core, which was for .NET Core. But now that we've gone beyond into 5, they can't call it ASP.NET because ASP.NET is still existing in 4.8 of .NET Framework. So we still have ASP.NET Core. Is what it is, okay? And that, in a nutshell, is the changes that happen from .NET to .NET, well, .NET Framework to .NET Core to .NET. Also .NET Standard thrown in there, but that's a different story. That's to help bridge the gap. So that's kind of the fast-paced, high-level overview of where we are today, .NET 7. Now, what Microsoft has done is every year they've committed to putting out a new version of .NET in November. So at .NET Conf, every year, there'll be a new version of .NET, and it alternates. So right now we're on .NET 7. That was released in 2022 November. In 2023 November, we'll get .NET 8. The difference is that .NET 7, because it's an odd version, is what's called an STS, or Standard Term Support, which means it's supported for 18 months. Then we have the even versions, which .NET 6 currently is the LTS version, the long-term support. And then in .NET 8, we'll have a long-term support again. So it alternates standard term support and long-term support. So let's start with, we're going to create a new project here. And I'm going to create, let's do a console app first. And I'm going to call this Net 5. Let's call it versions. All right, and we're going to choose .NET 5, which is out of support, okay, just so you know. But I'm trying to show you the difference between .NET 5 and then the really big jump to .NET 6, although we'll go to 7 directly. But this is the .NET 5 project. Okay, and this code, just so you know, works even in .NET Framework. I mean, like, it's the same code. And of course, this demo obviously will. But this is a .NET 5 console app, all right? So we've got the namespace, we've got the internal class program, we've got static void main, and then we have our console write line for hello world. All right, so let's create a new project. We're creating another console app. We're going to call this, let's do Net 7. And we're going to say this is a .NET 7, which also notice they do put right in there long-term support versus standard term support in case you forget. But again, even numbers, long-term support. All right? And that's the new version. Okay? So just to compare these two, let's put them side by side. On the left is .NET 5. On the right is .NET 7. Can any, you know, one of those, when you go to the doctor's office, you see those little like word or the picture finds things, what things are different? Can you spot the differences? One or two, right? So this is the new version in .NET 7. And what they've done is they said, hey, you know, we've got a whole bunch of stuff in here we don't need. And so they started throwing stuff out. And they just kept throwing stuff out. And at the end of the day, what we got to is just a place we can start typing code. So under the covers, behind the scenes, these two are basically the same. Okay, so they compile the same, they run the same, they work the same. But some stuff is hidden and some stuff is just not necessary. So let's talk through it. First of all, we're going to ignore using system. We're going to come right back to that in a little bit. We're going to talk more with that. But we get to our namespace. How many of you call into your static void main inside your application? Meaning somewhere else you call that method. Okay. Every once in a while, someone says they do. And I do the head tilt at them, and I'm like, don't. Just don't. So the idea behind static void main is it's the starting point of your application. It's the place where your application knows, I go here, I run the application. Now, technically, you don't have to start at static void main. Did you know this? You can actually go into your settings and say, I want to start at this other method. Again, why? Because, okay? Yes, technically there are reasons. And Microsoft is very, very good about allowing you to be flexible and giving you the options you need. It's unfortunately also one of their downsides too. They give you all the options and then go, why is this confusing? You only have 1,000 options, right? Because I want 2, not 1,000. But with enterprise customers and with all these different scenarios they see, they're like, hey, maybe you want 3 entry points into your console application. Maybe you want to have different places, different methods, and different areas that you can use. Maybe you want to call your main again somehow and do some kind of recursion with your main entry point. I'm not sure. Yes? You could do that, yes. So if you, I would still argue that not great, but you could. You could definitely rename your mains in order to say this application name instead. So what they did is they said most people aren't doing that. Most people just say static void main, just go do stuff. And so they said, well, if you're just making this an entry point, then you don't need a namespace because you're not actually calling this. And a namespace is meant to be the top level for you calling something. You're not calling it, therefore you don't need a namespace. Well, you also don't need a program because if you're not calling it, then you don't need a class name to encapsulate it. And yes, what this does do is it eliminates the ability to put your other methods inside a program. But again, we encourage you when it comes to the single responsibility principle that if you have an entry point, and that's the whole reason for this thing to change, then maybe it should also have other reasons to change. Therefore, it should do one thing. And if it's doing one thing, it doesn't need a class. They got rid of that. And then method, we don't actually call this. We don't actually call this in our application. Again, normally. You absolutely can. But normally we don't. Therefore, we don't need that either. Well, almost. So, but with that, what we get rid of is 3 levels of indent, and we get rid of all of this boilerplate. That's all it really is boilerplate. It's a stuff that we see, we know what it is because we've done it 1,000 times. We say, hey, you know what? It's just there. I ignore it. It kind of tune it out because it's always there. But the reality is it doesn't have to be. And so Microsoft said, hey, let's just create a Program.cs and say that that's the entry point. Technically what this is this is inside of a static void main. So it's inside of it, and when you run your application, it will execute as if it's inside of it. However, it does not have a namespace, which means that if you want to access something else in the same namespace, you actually have to have a using statement for that namespace. So let me illustrate this. If I were to create a new class, add new item. By the way, this is new. I don't know if you've seen this before. I love this. This is the much faster way of creating files. You can say that show all templates and go back to the original way of doing things, but then you go back to the compact view and just say person model. Like so. So now I have a person model. Let's just put a ID. Okay. So in my, I can't just say person model. If I do that, notice it adds a using up top. Yeah, it's nice. But it adds a using up top for my net 7. So unlike here in net 5, where I could just reference it because it's in the same namespace, but because it's not actually technically in a namespace, therefore you have to reference that namespace should you want to access it. That's a big deal, or big difference. So with that, oh, by the way, have you all seen this new syntax? Yeah, okay. I love the syntax. This, I think, is excellent. There's like 5 different ways to declare things now. You can also say var q equals new person model. You can also say person model r equals new person model. Like, these are all equivalent. You get to choose. Personally, for me, I prefer this method because of the fact that the declaration's on the far left-hand side. So you're reading top to bottom, left to right. You see what type it is before you see the name of it. So that, to me, makes sense. And if you already have it here, why are you repeating it over on the right? So this repetition just isn't necessary. So, yeah, so you can, yes, I don't want that, but thank you for offering. var, just so we're very clear before we go on, this is not like JavaScript var. It can't be reassigned to a different type. It is a strongly typed. It's not dynamic type. Therefore, this will always be a person model. Okay. So going back to where we were with our application. Oh, by the way, there were 2 lines in here. There still are now. This first line up top says, hey, this is a new template. And for more information, click that link. You can get information about why the template is different and how it works. So just so you know, that is at the top of every one of these you create. So that's the new Program.cs. That's where your entry point is for your application. That makes your application much leaner and much less boilerplate. Now, you do not have to use it. I know a lot of people who just don't like the change, and that's fine. And you know what? If you already have a code base that's full of, you have 29 applications with an entry point that has, internal class and static void main and all the rest, maybe the 30th one shouldn't be different. In that case, then keep it the same. And so when you're creating your template, or your project from the template, so you say new console app, and let's just call this, I don't know, net 6. It's going to ask you right here, do not use top level statements. If you check that, then what it's going to do is it's going to give you back the static void main and all the rest. So if you want the old way of doing things, just check the box. Personally, I love this. It's simple. It works. We're going to see it more with minimal APIs, but this is a really helpful tool. It just keeps things really clean and neat, especially since with minimal APIs, you're targeting typically is a microservice. Well, with a microservice, you don't want to have tons of code all over and just tons of code. And so this allows you to create, we're going to create, I think, a 3 or 4 line microservice API tonight. So 4 lines of code, it's the entire thing, including redirection to HTTPS. So it's a whole lot simpler to do it this way. All right, I did want to point out a couple of things here. First of all, this. So we have string args. Now, string args are to come from the command line, so you can pass in parameters to your console application or other application. But the question is, where are they over on the right? Where are they in .NET 7? Well, technically, where they are is they are still there, just hidden. This is one of the areas that I am not a fan of. So like I said, they kept throwing stuff out and throwing stuff out and throwing stuff out in order to get to what we have on the right. But I think they threw one thing too many out. Okay, because what we have now is a bit of magic. I hate magic. I hate teaching magic. I hate talking about magic because of the fact that, sorry, any magicians in here, it's not for your day job, at least not for your developer. But what happens is it's hidden behind the scenes. It's there. It's just not visible. You have to know it's there. Now, I don't know how many of you use args regularly, but it's, you do once in a while at least. All right, so they should be there. They should be visible in some way. That's my one big kind of gripe from Microsoft is, hey, just make it visible in some way. But it's not. The other thing that's not visible that I'm kind of okay with, but yes, it is an implied thing here is, well, two things. First of all, this can return a value. So you can return integer from your program. You can still do that. Just say return a number. And again, where you don't see that's void versus int. Okay, it's kind of hidden. The other thing is that you can call asynchronous methods and await them. Again, we're not decorating this to say this is an async method. That gets done automatically. So it's something else that's hidden. It's just there, it just works. Okay. I like the fact that it just works, but it is a little bit magical. So, all right. Any questions before we move on? Just ask for them. So you say, string A equals args 0. Yeah. Like I said, magic, but it works. So, correct. Yep. Yeah, so there's like, I don't know how many different variations behind the scenes that it will figure out at compile time based upon what you're using. So, no. Sorry. There's not a great way besides learning it. They don't do discovery well. And that is a point of frustration of mine, is that there's a lot of great things built into it, but you have to know about it in order to know how to use it. So with that, the other thing that came out of this we didn't talk about yet is using system. We're doing console.writeLine, which technically is system.console.writeLine, but we use a using directive in order to say, hey, shortcut this to this console.writeLine. On the right, we just say console.writeLine, but there is no using system. So where is that? Magic. Yeah, it's with the args. It actually is kind of sort of visible. This is what's called implicit usings. Microsoft came up with two different ideas with .NET 6, I believe, where they said, hey, we're sticking usings all over the place. I mean, you start up a new template and there's like all these using statements or using directives. In fact, the person model has 5 of them. Notice we're using 0 of them. And as you saw before, this is a newer feature of the editor too. If I were to say person model, notice there's no using. But if I just hit tab here, it puts it in. So whenever I need one, it just shoves it up top. So it's really good about handling those. So where are the usings? Well, Microsoft said some we just use all the time. Like every application has at the top of the using system. Everyone has one line for using system. So therefore, what if we just said you always get that? And so instead of trying to create this weird setup where they try and combine all the DLLs and put them all in the same namespace and change everything, they said, hey, how about instead of that, we'll create what's called implicit usings. And so every file now has implicit usings. Let's close up the .NET 5 version. Every file has implicit usings unless you turn it off. So if we go to .NET 7, you see right here under the program, you can also edit the CS proj file now live in .NET Core, which is awesome. Use that. So right here, we see implicit usings is enabled by default. What that means is there's some hidden usings that are applied to every single file in the entire project. Again, a little bit of magic. But there is a way to find this, and you're going to love it. So if you show all files, and then you go to the OBJ folder, and then you go to debug, and then you go to Net 7, and then in here, you'll look for Net 7, well, Net 7 is the name of my project, .globalusings.g.cs. This is a generated file. And this is where all of your implicit usings are. You can see that actually one of them is lit up because we're actually using system, and the rest of them are not. But these are the implicit usings for a .NET Core console project. They'll be different for a web project. Yes? So the usings never get hit in a breakpoint, so you'll never stop it. Yeah, it would stop at the very first line if you said start with at a breakpoint. Yeah. So, I mean, if you right click here and say quick actions refactoring and say remove unnecessary usings. There you go. No, they're not. I know. We have read line, we don't have write line. You can create your own snippet though. I actually have a video on doing that. Yep. So now, okay, there's two things here. One is, yes, you can clean them up with the quick actions refactoring, which quick actions refactoring, use it, love it. It's awesome. Definitely, wherever you are, just control dot. You'll find new stuff you can do. Like it's impressive. So that's one of them, but they are working on new file templates. Unfortunately, the file templates have not evolved with the new changes in .NET. And so like this file template is not the new style of doing things because it's just a .cs file. So there's still a whole bunch of stuff in here. For example, it has using system, even though we already have that as an implicit using. So stop doing this to me, okay? But it wasn't high on their priority list. They still have a whole bunch of old templates out there. So you'll see different ways of doing things depending on which template you use. Too. Now, so these are the global implicit usings. These are the ones that come out of the box for free. Well, free is a relative term. But you can, kind of, don't touch that file, okay? But yes, you can make changes to which ones go in it. I would encourage you not to, but you can. So what you can do is in here, and I don't have the code demo for because I never use it. After I demoed it once and went, yep, that works, but I won't use it. Is you can put in here to say, hey, put this into the implicit using. Do you not use Entity Framework? So that's where Link is so big, is Entity Framework. And well, I mean, it's not hurting anything. So unlike C or C++, this isn't actually putting new DLLs into your application, not bloating your application. All it's doing is shortcutting the calls. So the only time you have a problem with implicit usings is if you had a name conflict. So if you decided that you want to create your own class called console, don't do that. But you could, and you just put it, I am timcorey.console because it's better. I won't because it's stupid, usually. But there are cases, and in that case, yes, you'd have a naming conflict. If you have your using directive and Microsoft has their implicit using directive and they conflict. Now, Microsoft, this is a little more magic. Microsoft has gotten better about saying which one's closer and use that one. So yeah, it's scary. It should just tell you, no, don't do this. But it technically sometimes will work. I've tried it. I'm like, okay, I'm going to show off, conflicting namespaces, and it just works. And I'm like, that ain't right. That ain't right. So my word of wisdom to you is just don't create conflicts with Microsoft stuff. That's number one. Okay, but you can turn off implicit using just by saying disable or by deleting this entire line if you don't want them at all. You can also modify which ones go in here by adding a new entry into your Program.cs proj file. And you can put other things into the implicit usings, and then they will show up here. Notice it says this is auto-generated, which means don't touch it because it's going to get rebuilt every time anyway, so you're wasting your time putting stuff in here. However, there is another thing they did, which in my opinion should be the only thing they did, but they decided again to do implicit, and that is they have global usings. Global usings are not implicit. You actually put them in a file somewhere. So let's do that. So right now in our program.cs, if we wanted to add person model, we have to add that using for net 7. However, if I create a new file, I can put this anywhere, but I prefer to call it something like global usings.cs and just get rid of everything. And then you can say global using net 7. What that will do is that will apply that namespace to every file in your application. Now you, I believe, can do multiple layers of these inside folders and say only in this folder. Just do one. One global. Okay, global is global. So with that, I can come back over here now and I can say person model p equals new, like so, and it just works because it's global. But at the same time, when I come in here, I can look at what are the global usings and see them. My personal preference is Microsoft should have put the implicit usings in this file. Just giving you an extra file called global usings that you can hit delete on and it's gone. Or you can modify very easily by saying, hey, just add another global to it. So if you want to not have implicit usings, then just turn them off, copy what they had, and paste them in here, modify to your heart's content. There you go. Okay. But this allows you to not have to have the using directive at the very top for example, your data namespace, because you're going to have DTOs, you're going to have them all over your application. You're probably going to reference that over and over and over again. Just put it in a global user. And again, we're not importing anything. We're not bringing in new DLLs with this. We're just shortcutting the namespace. So as long as we don't have any stepping on toes, we're good. Now, if you have 10 million lines of code and 100,000 different namespaces, yeah, maybe don't do that because you'll probably have a lot of conflicts. So I say something, I've seen a thing or two. So, all right. So that is our global usings versus our implicit usings. One more thing we didn't talk about yet, and that is in this file right here, we have the traditional way of creating a namespace. We have a namespace, and then that wraps a class. However, again, Microsoft is looking at these things and saying, how do people actually use them? Because that's what we're trying to target is, how can we make the developer's life easier and the development experience better? Remember, code is meant to be read by humans, not by machines, by humans. Because that's our whole job, is reading and writing code, mostly reading. And the compiler's job is to take it from where we wrote it and figure out how to make it something it can read. So our code is meant to be read by humans, and yet we're doing some things that are over and over again repetitive, that are just taking up space and taking up our reading space as well. And so, for example, these are gone. So quick action refactoring, move those. But the next thing they looked at was the namespace, and they said, hey, how many people, and let's do a poll. How many of you use multiple different namespaces in one file? Okay, good. Like, again, if we're talking about the single responsibility principle, maybe you don't have two namespaces in one file. That's a little bit of a overkill. So since that's the case, they said, hey, let's create file scope namespaces. So instead of wrapping your entire code in curly brackets and indenting it, typically 4 spaces, what we're going to do instead is put a semicolon at the end of your namespace, and it shifts everything back to the left. You save 4 spaces on every single line from the entire file. Okay? Gives you a little more horizontal real estate to read your code. So that's all file scope namespaces are. Now, the only thing that's going to bite you here is you cannot have more than one file scope namespace in a file. Can anyone think why a file scope namespace can't have a second file scope namespace in one file? There you go. So if you want more than one, that's not me. Okay, good. If you want more than one namespace in one file for whatever reason, the cool thing is just undo that. And actually, quick action refactoring, you can say convert to block scope namespace. There you go. And now you can say namespace net8. Okay? Woohoo. Again, I'm curious as to why that's effective for you, but you can do it, all right? And that's one of the things that I do want to, I spend a lot of time pointing out all the things Microsoft does poorly because that's my job. I mean, part of my job is training people and saying, okay, let's work around this problem. But at the same time, Microsoft has done a ton of good stuff. A lot of this stuff is amazing. They've made our lives easier, better, made the development experience better. And so overall, this is great stuff, and I think this is wonderful. The really cool thing I love about what Microsoft is doing is they're also saying they understand that not everybody is going to be on .NET 8 in November of 2023. Not everybody, the day it comes out, is waiting to download so they can upgrade all their code. Okay? And so since that is not the case, your code base is not always going to be the latest stuff. And even more significantly, your code base was not created in .NET 8 on November of 2023. Your code base may have been created 20 years ago. And the patterns we do, the way we do things has evolved over time. And so they're doing new things like this. But they say, you know what? That may not match how the rest of your code base works. And instead of saying, well, change it all, and just YOLO it, instead what you say is, you can go back to the old way, no problem. So you don't like top-level statements? No problem. Check that box, and you're back to the way it used to be. You don't like file scope namespace? No problem. Go back to the block scope namespace. If you don't like implicit usings, just turn them off. If you don't like global usings, don't use them. So a lot of the stuff that we're looking at is stuff that is just optional. You get to choose what you want to use and what you don't want to use. So again, I poke fun at Microsoft a little bit. I point out the stuff that they could do better. But there's an awful lot of stuff that they do great. And that's the reason why I still teach C#, because they do some awesome stuff. Okay. Any other questions before we go on? Okay. One last thing to point out before I forget, and then we'll get off of this one. If you want to create a method inside of here, it's technically possible. So if I were to say let's be right, double add, double X, double Y, thank you. And I can say return, there you go. Okay, that works. Now, this is not necessarily what it appears to be, because if I were to move this up here, it's not going to work. Okay, well, at least it shouldn't. It says to start up project, make sure it doesn't work. I did, just so you know, I did in true developer fashion, I updated my Visual Studio right before he came. So, hey, it works. They've changed things. Okay. It used to be, and in some versions it still is, that this does not work inside your program.cs above your code. What they said was, hey, put your methods at the bottom. So if you have a problem, put your methods at the bottom if you're using this, this new top-level statement for your program.cs. It's just in program.cs. The other thing, though, too, is this is not a traditional method. It's a local method. So what this means is you cannot call it from somewhere else. It only works in program.cs. This actually is a thing throughout all of C#. You can create local methods other places. They're not something you use all the time. But what it is, you can actually create a named method inside of a method to have just a little bit of reusable code. Again, how often do you use that? Not a ton. And especially if you're looking at, if you come back to single responsibility principle, if you've got a method inside of a method, maybe it's doing more than one thing. Maybe not. Maybe it's the right thing to do, but maybe you should at least look at it. It's scoped to program main. Yes, it's scoped to the method that it's in. So, yes. Okay. So, I love the fact that worked. Hey, if you have a demo that goes right instead of wrong, I guess it's better. But yeah. All right, let's look at, let's create a new solution. Close solution, we're gonna start a new one. And let's create a WinForms project. I believe I have .NET Framework. Yeah, so this is another thing that as a teacher, especially a teacher of newer C# developers, has frustrated me. And something to keep an eye on when you're looking at this list of all that you could do in C# or in .NET in general. At one point, it was a WinForm application and then a WinForm.NET Core. And now it's WinForm application, which is .NET 7, or WinForm.NET Framework. Just keep an eye on what you're creating when you create it, because you create the wrong one. In our case, we're going to intentionally create the wrong one, or the old one at least, .NET Framework. And we'll call it Framework and Framework app. So this is currently 4.7.2. Doesn't really matter which version I create. But this is the almighty WinForm app. I'm sure that you know it and you love it. You can't wait to get back to it. The one thing I love about this is they assume that the default font size should be 8. My poor eyes, that's not a good thing. Let's go to 18. So we're not going to go crazy. We're just going to create a WinForm app. Okay. You could open a toolbox, drag and drop some stuff on there, like you were the first day of your first C# class. But this is a WinForm app. It does run, I hope. There you go. WinForm, yay. You're now experienced programmers. So with this application, we're in the .NET framework. How do you get to .NET 7? I'm going to show you. Now, I'm showing you all the stuff from the Microsoft side. Obviously, I'm going to do this in about 5 minutes in a demo. When you go back to your application that has 1 million lines of code, and it has 10,000 different forms with 30,000 different user controls from third-party libraries, it will take you a bit more than 5 minutes, okay? But I'm going to show you the Microsoft side of things, what Microsoft needs you to do in order to upgrade to .NET 7 from 4.7 framework, or any version of .NET framework, really. So right-click on your project and say Unload Project. In .NET framework, you cannot edit the CS proj file while it's running. There's a CS proj file. You remember this? Do you love this? This is super obvious stuff in here. I'm sure that you all have it memorized and know all 83 lines that come out of the box with nothing configured. 83 lines. That's awesome. So, in order to upgrade this to .NET 7, now I don't have any NuGet packages installed. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if this is just a WinForm project with no third-party dependencies, I come over here, I say Control-A, hit backspace. Let's start there, okay? This is the new template. I'm going to type it all out. So project, the SDK equals Microsoft.net.SDK. Okay. Inside here, we say property group. Inside the property group, we have the output type. I know some IntelliSense in here, which is wonderful. Doesn't work for everything. And unfortunately, you are going to be typing XML, which I'm sure, how many people here love XML? You're a little weird, just even to say, but okay. I personally hate XML. It's just, I love JSON. I think it's easy and intuitive. I heard that sigh, but I haven't tried. I don't know. With WCF core, you might be able to. So it's better than YAML. That's not a high bar, but why do we have a third standard? Because Microsoft, I guess. Okay, so you have the output type saying it's a Windows exe. We have the target framework. And that target framework is going to be Net 7.0-Windows. This is important because one of the key foundations of .NET is the fact that it's cross-platform. So you can use it on Windows, on Linux, on Mac. Windows Forms, guess where it can run? It's tied to Windows. It unfortunately is tied directly into Windows DLLs. And so even though it runs on the .NET 7 backend code, it still only works on Windows. Now, why would you upgrade them? Because you will see orders of magnitude speed increases with your same code, just running it in .NET 7 compared to .NET Framework. It's incredible, the speed difference. Every time they put out a new version of .NET, there is a significant speed increase somewhere. They're trying to optimize every single bit of the stack. So just moving to .NET Core will be a huge deal for your company. However, they can't bring all the Linux and Mac stuff, or don't need the Linux and Mac stuff. And in fact, they have to bring extra stuff in order to connect to Windows. Therefore, you're not just on Net 7.0, you're on Net 7.0-Windows, which says, hey, bring the extra Windows stuff in to this. So Nullable, we'll talk about that in a minute, but we're going to say enable for now. Nullable is really cool. Again, we're going to talk about that. Use Windows Forms is true. Good idea right there. And then, I know you'll love it, implicit usings. Sure, go ahead and enable it. Okay, guess what? That's it. And in fact, if you didn't want implicit usings, get rid of it. And if you don't want nullable, get rid of it. So now you're down to 4 actual entries, 3 actual entries, right? And there's a couple of tags, and that's it. Now what we can do is we can right-click on our, there you go. Right-click and say reload project. And it's back, loading back up. Takes a little bit. This is the brand new form designer. It works kind of like the old designer, only a little bit worse. So the reason why is we had to create something brand new in order to get all the old stuff to work on it, which is it's still tied into Windows, and so they had to redo everything. So unfortunately, they had to rebuild it when they didn't really expect to or want to. But the entire community said, this is the #1 desktop app type we use. So therefore, bring it over. And Microsoft said, okay, and they did. Now, the other thing that comes with this is in properties, you have a whole bunch of stuff here. Guess what? Delete it. Don't need it. And in fact, it'll cause a conflict if you don't have it deleted. So once we delete this, thank you, Windows, for pausing on that, this application will now run. This is now a .NET 7 WinForm project. That's all it takes. And the benefit there also, we get to actually look at our project file and change it in line. We don't have to unload it anymore. So that's all the upgrade process really takes from a purely what Microsoft gave you out of the box perspective. Now, Yes, there are large caveats. I'm not trying to hide those. One of them is NuGet packages. So NuGet packages, we used to have a separate file that stored all the NuGet packages. And then we had, I forget all the names Microsoft has given it over the years. But we've now got this thing where we put the NuGet packages into our CS proj file. So it joins the two. If you're going to upgrade to .NET 7, I would encourage you not to do that step if you haven't yet, because we just deleted everything. If you have your NuGet packages in there, we've got rid of all NuGet packages. You have to put them back. That's kind of painful. But if you leave them that separate file, then you at least have the list of all your NuGet packages. And you can put them back in either manually or through the command line or a number of different ways. So just note that that's one of the things you have to think through when moving things over. Also, when you upgrade to .NET 7, your NuGet packages will probably have to change too. So, okay? But that's the upgrade process from a Microsoft standpoint. There are some things that are still hanging around here that are kind of legacy. For example, we have app.config. We don't use app.config anymore. We use appsettings.json. However, and this is one of the things I experienced, I built, I don't know if you've watched my YouTube channel, but I built a Windows Form application called Tournament Tracker. And we built this whole thing in .NET Framework. I published it as a course. It's also online for free. And then later, when .NET Core 3.1 came around, I said, hey, I want to upgrade a kind of real project. And so I took that Tournament Tracker application and upgraded it. And it used connection strings and it used app settings for other things. And it just works. Even though this is not how we do things anymore. We don't use app.config or web.config inside of a .NET 7 project. It still works. Again, Microsoft is saying, hey, we know you're going to upgrade, so we're going to help you do that. So this will still work, but once you're no longer using it, then you have to delete it. Also, in here, we don't do things exactly this way anymore. So we would change these 3 lines if we want. Again, this still works, but we could update these 3 lines with 2 application configuration.initialization and application.run. So those are the only 2 things that would change. So these 2 lines go away and a new line comes in. But again, you don't have to change that. It will still just work the old way. All right? So that's upgrading to .NET 7. Piece of cake. I'm expecting everyone that's on .NET Framework to just jump right up. Tell them Tim sent you. And my consulting rate is. So, a lot more stuff to cover, but let's keep going. Let's close the solution, and we're going to create a new one. And this time, let's do an MVC project. So, MVC. Wait for it. No. There we go. Okay. The web projects changed just a scooch from .NET Framework to .NET Core, or .NET 7. So in .NET Framework, we had basically web forms, which was Microsoft's idea of let's take WinForms to the web. WinForms is so awesome. It was a different time. But they also had MVC, which was their one attempt at let's create a server-side language application that is more in line with modern standards, but it's still .NET Framework. And they also had WCF and API. Those are the kind of the 4 main web project types. When .NET Core came around, they said, hey, some of this stuff doesn't really work inside the new paradigm. And so they said web forms, the way it does things with session everything, stick everything in the session and just carry it around like a big bag on your shoulder. That's not how we want to do things going forward. And so they dumped web forms entirely. Web forms did not come over to .NET Core. They all looked at MVC and said, cool, we like it. Let's move it over to .NET Core basically as it is. So the kind of architecture behind the scenes changed a little bit, but the actual code itself is pretty much the same stuff. Then they looked at API, said, yep, love it, let's move it over. And then they looked at WCF and said, hey, no one uses this outside of Microsoft circles. Why? Because Microsoft said, use it or else. And so they said, what is everybody using? And they said, well, gRPC. Came from Google. Google created it in order to have their servers communicate directly, much more quickly than API. And so the industry kind of settled on gRPC as the new way to have web communication in a much faster binary stream type method. And so Microsoft said, yes, we can adopt that. And so they adopted gRPC and they dropped WCF. WCF and gRPC are not the same thing. There's features in WCF that are not in gRPC. Sorry. But the community came along and said, hey, you know what? We still use WCF and we want to move to .NET Core. We can't because you're saying, oh, well. So Microsoft basically gave all the WCF code to an open source community, and they have helped them then build WCF Core. So there is a WCF Core, I believe version 1.4 just came out, something like that, that does work. And it does allow you to upgrade your legacy application to a .NET 7. It is not designed for new projects, okay, just to be clear there. So what we're going to look at is MVC because of the fact that it's the same MVC structure in both .NET Framework and .NET Code, or Core. So you should probably recognize it. But there are other types, and unfortunately, their naming conventions in the templates are horrible, okay? So this is ASP.NET Core Web App, in parentheses, Model View Controller. That's MVC, as opposed to ASP.NET Core Web API. That's API. There's also MVC Core Web App, which is Razor Pages. Yay. Okay, so looking at MVC. And we're going to choose MVC 5 for this one. And we're going to call this MVC apps. And we'll choose .NET 5 for this because there are some significant changes between the two. One of the things that's really nice about all .NET Core projects is this checkbox right here that says configure for HTTPS. Leave that checked all the time. Do not uncheck that. I don't think it should be an option. I think they should strong arm you into doing it. I'm almost to the point of put that into the behind the scenes template and make it, implicit. I'm not, yeah, make it magic, just works. I'm not quite there because I still do hate magic, but it should be on all the time. The web is HTTPS now, okay? There is no more HTTP, it shouldn't be. So leave that checked, it's gonna just work. They do have support for Docker right out of the box, which is great. You just check this box, it'll create a Docker script for you, a Docker file, and you can just run it in Docker. We're not gonna do that, but you can. And notice when you choose that, you have to choose Linux or Windows. You can run it on Linux by default, which is what you should do. But if you have legacy stuff where you can't get around using Windows, then you can run it in a Windows, Linux, or Docker container. So we're not going to do that. But this is .NET 5. Ignore the enable Razor runtime. That goes away in .NET 7. Okay, so this is MVC 5. Let's create one more real quick. And we're going to create a MVC. Oh, it's already right there. MVC application, we'll call this MVC 7. And we want this to be 7. Notice the option change down here. It's now do not use top level statements. So if you, again, you want your program.cs to have your static void main in it, go ahead and check that box. We're not going to. We're going to go the new direction. All right. And we're not going to use authentication. Okay. So these are the two versions of MVC in .NET, so .NET 5 and .NET 7. Things have changed. So for example, in .NET 5, we have Program.cs and we have startup. Okay? If you've ever built a web application in .NET, you're probably familiar with these two. With .NET 7, we do not have a startup.cs. We only have a program.cs. Okay? This is everything. What they said was, let's look at this. Program.cs. First of all, notice all the stuff. It's just kind of hanging here. It's just boilerplate. But then we have static void main, which does exactly one thing. It calls another method, which does exactly one thing. It called, well, technically two. It calls the default builder, and then it adds a little bit of configuration. Okay? And then we have startup.cs where all the work happens. And so Microsoft said, why do we have two files to do one thing? Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing. So they said, hey, let's kind of bring those together. And so now we have one file that does everything. Also top-level statements, which means we don't have all the boilerplate stuff. We just start right in on the code on line 1. So we have our create builder right here. By the way, the create builder line sets up all your defaults. In fact, I think if I mouse over it in startup or in program.cs, yeah. So this, if you can read that, you probably can't. It's okay. We moused over it in .NET 5. The defaults builder would give you all the stuff it does by default. This is where some of that magic comes in that's kind of configured for you by default in web projects. That's what's happening behind the scenes, is configuring all this stuff. But what's happening is, and let's close out the other things. So what's happening with this create builder is it's setting up your app settings.json. It's setting up your ability to do dependency injection. It's setting up your logger by default. And it's configuring your application to be ready with the defaults to run for a web application. And Microsoft has said, hey, we're going to have some defaults that are just standard. And I love this. It said there's things that you probably should be doing in every application. You should probably be doing dependency injection. You should probably be doing logging. We're going to set those up for you so that they're ready, and then you can override them to whatever you want. But they're in there by default. It just works. And that's what happens inside this create builder. It's not displayed anywhere, so you can't just look at it and see, oh, that's what it's doing. But it's happening. Okay? Right here is all of your dependency injection now. So it's all in line. It's just line 4 is your dependency injection. In this case, we only do one thing, which is builder.services.add controller views. That's your MVC. If you want to add your own, you would just say builder.services.add transient, or add singleton, or add scope. You can add it to dependency injection. And we might do that in the future. Then it actually builds your application. It prepares it to run. And the reason why it builds it is because then we can have access to, one of the things we have access to is our app settings.json. This is all our configuration information. So by default, once we do this, we can access our app settings.json. We can also access our services. So if we need a service access inside of our program.cs, we can do it after we build. So here we check the environment. If we're not in development, then we set up a exception page that's not the, here's all my source code. It's actually just the safe exception page. And we also use HSTS. Again, more security and safety. There's your automatic redirection to HTTPS. That's all it is. Boom, done. This is the other thing I love about the new Microsoft and the new .NET is they decided to spend a lot of time thinking through naming, which is hard. We all know this. Naming is hard. But they thought through naming because if you've never seen it before and you read through it, what do you think line 16 does? It uses the HTTPS redirection. So if you want to modify the HTTPS redirection or not have it, where do you think you'd go? Line 16. It reads like it's meant to be read. Okay? So use static files. Well, if you have a problem with static files, you need to adjust something with your static files, find a place to go. Use routing, use authorization, map the controllers, and then finally run. So in 27 lines, we have configured everything about MVC. Now, when you look at our controllers, they are going to look standard. In fact, this is the old template. You can put the semicolon there and move back. This is the old template. It's the old code. It just works. They have shown for you the fact that you can inject your logger. This comes, again, out of the box. And by default, the .NET Core logger only logs to console, debug, and the logger on Azure, but that's it. So it's a really simplistic logger. It's just meant to be a placeholder. You want to use logging, and you should use something like Serolog, which just overrides the iLogger. So all your code still works with iLogger, but then you just override it in Program.cs and say use Serolog instead and log it here, and there you go. You've now got structured logging going to, let's say, Seek automatically. So, and that's dependency injection. So it kind of modeled for you how this thing should work and set it up, but it's the same exact controller as we have in .NET 5. And it's very, very similar to our controllers in the .NET framework. We just don't have the dependency injection for iLogger, I don't believe, in .NET framework. It's been a while since I used framework. So questions are the difference between 5 and 7. Okay, we're gonna keep going. I got more stuff covered. Let's look at one of the newer project types in the web, and that is Blazor. How many of you have used Blazor before? Yay. All right. So Blazor is pretty awesome. We're going to call this, just Blazor 1's fine. And .NET 7, yep, that's cool. Blazor is one of the new project types. There's actually 2 different types of Blazor right now. There's Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. So Blazor Server, it runs completely server-side. So it's all server-side, which means all your code is safely and securely on the server. It's not going down to the client. However, it acts like a client-side web application. Let's just run this. This is a Blazor Server project. So all of my code, like I said, is on the server. It's not coming to the client. The client has no access to my C# code. However, when this launches, there we go. We got our Blazor application. And if I click this button without any reload of the page, I can update this value. So how does that work if it's fully server-side? Well, it's using a tool called SignalR to have a connection between the server and some JavaScript on the client side. So the JavaScript on the client side just watches the interaction on your page and tells the server, hey, I need some new code to stick in here, and does it. So it's all server-side, but there is an open connection that's running behind the scenes that's called a WebSocket, typically. This is, again, this is the new Microsoft. This is a web standard way of communicating. It's not a Microsoft-specific standard. So when you hear SignalR, which is a Microsoft-specific thing, you might think, oh, it's Microsoft-specific. Well, actually what's happening is Microsoft just wrapped web sockets. And the reason they did that is because not every browser supports WebSockets. And so there's other mechanisms like long polling they can fall back to. And so it says, hey, you probably don't want to know how to write long polling code and the fallback code and the retry code and all the rest. Why don't we do that for you? And you just say connect, and it just works. Yes? Okay, well, Internet Explorer. Shocker. So anymore, it's pretty much everyone supports WebSockets. When SignalR came out, the market share for WebSockets was very small. And so it was, well, IE was more the king of browsers, unfortunately, the battered king. But now it's more a matter of they provide the retry capabilities, they provide the keep alive capabilities, and some other things inside that wrapper. But yes, in theory, it should be that that is always open. It used to be, oh goodness, not 2 years ago maybe, in Azure, it did not by default support WebSockets. And so on your server, it wouldn't support WebSockets, which would mean that if you ran Blazor, it'd fall back to, I forget the next level down. It'd fall back to that though. And there's a checkbox. You had to check the box that says support WebSockets. Not all web hosts are as modern and up-to-date as Azure is, so there's probably still web hosts out there that would not support WebSockets. So it could fall back on the server side as well. So it's still valuable, but yes, in theory, WebSockets should just work TM. So, all right. So that's Blazor. That's Blazor Server. There is another option called Blazor WebAssembly. If you ever heard of WebAssembly, it's not Microsoft's thing, it's a industry standard. I love the fact that we keep saying industry standard over and over again, because that means Microsoft is listening to a greater community than just their own vice presidents. So what they did was they adopted web standard and said, hey, we can use WebAssembly. We can use WebAssembly to put our C# code into it. WebAssembly is just some JavaScript that will allow you to run your web application inside the browser, even offline. You have a progressive web application, for example. Well, Blazor WebAssembly will take .NET Core and bring it all the way down to the client, along with your C# code, down to the client and run it on the client, which means you can run offline. You may hear the client has C# code and freak out, and yeah, you probably should. You should think that through, what you do and don't put in that C# code. But if you ever use Angular, React, or Vue, all the code goes to the client too. It's the same thing, it's just in C# code as opposed to JavaScript code. Yes? It's actually sending C# code. You can actually debug it in the browser. So, yes, there are ways you can try to make it less readable, but I believe you can still read, as of today, you can still read the C# code. No. So the whole goal there is to be able to debug it. You can't debug something that's compiled. So yes, but at the end of the day, what's the point? Because of the fact that your browsers has to understand it. And so if your browser has to understand it, there has to be some level of transparency, even if it was in intermediate language. That's still decompilable. And so it's not necessarily a security standard at that point. So what you're really doing is, well, it's kind of like minifying JavaScript. You can do it, and it's the right thing to do in production, but it's also a pain then when it comes to debugging that production server, which means you have then mappers to map your JavaScript back to raw JavaScript. And the reality is there's tools out there that can even take minified code and unmap it even without a map. So it's all obfuscated, all it is. And so at the end of the day, if you have code on the client, it is not secure. You can't put encryption stuff in there. You can't put database access, all that kind of stuff you cannot put on the client side. Just can't do it. Which is why with Blazor WebAssembly, we use API. You have an API in the back end, and you have Blazor WebAssembly in the front end, and then it is called the API. The user authenticates to the API, then it has access to what they have access to, and it's safe and secure. So, but yes. So WebAssembly, though, downloads all your code, which means as of right now, it's, I think, under 3 megabytes, but about 3 megabytes to download a basic .NET Core plus even a basic application down to the desktop, which some people freak out about. I wouldn't. And here's why. It's an application. It's not necessarily a website. If you want a website, there's different web types to use besides Blazor WebAssembly. So that 3 megabytes, not a big deal. If you go to pretty much any like news site, pick the news site. We're not going to choose which one. Pick a news site and go to it and open up your browser tools and look at the network. You'll see you're going to download between 10 and 20 megabytes on the home page alone. Okay, so this is not uncomfortable to do. What's that? Which just keeps scrolling. If you ever watch, it just keeps going up. They're abusive to your network. But with WebAssembly, you're taking a whole application to the desktop. One of the areas I saw a really great application for this was, we live in Pennsylvania, Comcast would come around to work on our internet. Well, if you're working on someone's internet, probably the internet is out. And if the internet's out, then you might not have a connection to a cell tower to do work. But that they had a help ticket, they had to document what they did, maybe they didn't complete it in one go. So they have to document everything but not close the ticket. and they have to do it all offline. So they had a progressive web application, so it did not matter which device they took, did not matter if they had Android devices or iPhone devices or iPads or whatever else, didn't matter. They could take it into the field, have the tickets loaded for that day. They could take pictures of my setup, store them. They got back into range. It would sync up with the cloud, and now my ticket's been updated. So some great applications for, again, applications, not websites necessarily. So that we have currently with Blazor is we have Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. There are new things coming with Blazor in .NET 8. Blazor is the newest web project. This was a web project that a few people at Microsoft really were off their meds that day, or not, taking too many meds or something, because they said, hey, we could probably do this. And they kind of workshopped it and went, yeah, this kind of works. And they showed it off at a conference. And everybody's like, yes, I want that. And so they created Blazor. And then it kind of took off from there. Now with .NET MAUI, how many have you've heard of .NET MAUI? Okay, .NET MAUI is the successor to Xamarin. It's the mobile and desktop platform type that works cross-platform. It works on Mac and on Windows, as well as iOS and Android, among others. But they use XAML for their .NET MAUI normally, but they also just said, hey, what if we just use that same Blazor stuff? And so they also have Blazor Hybrid, which works the same Blazor code we have here. We can just copy and paste into a mobile project and launch it into the App Store and it run. So Blazor is kind of creeping its way into more and more stuff that Microsoft does. Now with .NET 8, they're continuing to push the envelope of what it can do. These things are not finalized, so we can't say, yes, put a stamp in this. But what they're doing is looking at, hey, what if we mix these two? Because Blazor Server, when you start this up, it starts out immediately. It's like a server-side rendered application because it's a server-side rendered application. It renders on the server, then downloads, and then updates on the client. So it renders immediately, whereas Blazor WebAssembly has to download that app to you, which could be 3 or 4 megabytes. Slow connection, that's painful. You'll see loading, wait for it. So what if they kind of mix the two and said, hey, you got a Blazor Server application, but in the background, it will download the WebAssembly parts, and now it's offline capable. So you have the fast start and offline capable in the same application. So some good stuff there. They're looking at mixing other parts as well, maybe even making it a completely server-side language as well. So instead of MVC, you have Blazor, and it just runs just in the server, no connection needed, no signal R needed, for the things that are just rendered, like your About page. Your About page doesn't need a connection to the server, it doesn't change. So there's stuff like that they're looking at, they're working on, they're playing with. Don't download the latest bits and get all excited about what's going to happen, because things may change. Okay, but Blazor definitely has a very big future at Microsoft. It's definitely something they're investing in, and that the community also is saying, yes, we want that, we want more of that. So this, excuse me, this is Blazor. Wow, let's been talking for a little bit. Let's look though at one of the new features. I'm going to zoom in here. So you have this counter live, and let's go over to Visual Studio. We'll kind of put our code side by side here. And we're going to go to Solution Explorer. I'm going to open up Pages and go to Counter. And this counter page right here is what we're on right now. So if I click this, 15, 16, 17, 18. But what if I said, hey, you know what? I want to change this to, say, my counter, H1. I save it. And if we watch, it now says my counter on the page. And notice also the current count is still 18. So what it's done is what's called hot reload. What hot reload does is say, hey, every time you save, I'm going to reload, if I can, reload the page with the new information while saving the state of the page. So you can rapidly iterate and make changes and say, hey, this works, this doesn't. This is especially helpful in Blazor Hybrid, which is on MAUI, because trying to run on an emulator is a pain. Even on a great computer, emulators are horrible. And so you really don't want to start that emulator over again or start that app over again if you can help it. You start the app, and then use hot reload to make the changes. So we don't have to just make HTML changes. We can also say, you know what? Let's say plus equals 5 instead and save this. Notice the little check mark in the left-hand corner. So now if I click the click me, it says 23. So I've changed C# code, and it has updated. So this is really great for trying to play around and tinker with, especially if you're not a UI designer by default. I don't know about a lot of you, but I didn't grow up learning about CSS and design. I was a back-end developer initially, and so trying to make those changes at first was kind of difficult. Now I've spent a lot of time getting up to speed on it, but this allows you to say, hey, you know what? I don't know what change I need to make, but if I keep tweaking this thing, it'll keep updating, and I can see what I want to. I can see it visually, because I'm not a visual designer for Blazor or anything web, but now you have kind of a visual designer. So, all right. So that's hot reload. Okay. Any questions? 1, 2, 3. Oh. The more complex the code is, the smaller the chance it's going to work. For sure. Anything, especially that on startup, anything you want to do on startup, that's going to cause a problem because you've already started. It's kind of too late. Especially, and anything to do with instantiation of classes usually is a harder ask of it. So yeah, for sure. Okay. And by the way, this is Blazor server, which means there is a SignalR connection in the background. If you hit F12 in your browser and you go to network, you can look at the WebSockets when you refresh. And you'll see there's that WebSocket connection. WebSocket connection, if you ever watch it, it's super, super tiny. I mean, we're talking bytes. One of the things people ask is, okay, what does that mean for scalability of my app? If it's a Blazor server app, it has to have an open connection using SignalR, using WebSockets, between the client and the server at all times while the app is running. So what does that mean for scalability? On Azure with a decent size Azure web app, you can run between 10 and 20,000 concurrent connections. That's pretty big. And for most web applications, that is plenty. Because often we're not talking hits in a day, we're talking at the same time concurrent connections. If you want to go beyond that, though, you can scale out multiple web servers, or you can use the Azure SignalR service and offload that SignalR to Azure, and it will keep the connection open for however many you want. You're going to pay for it. I mean, Microsoft's not doing this for free, but you can scale this to infinity and beyond. But with the new Blazor stuff, it might not even be a problem. But it's something to think through is the fact that you do have an open connection that just stays open while your application runs. Yes. Yep. Correct. Yep. All right. So let's jump out of here and maximize. Come on. All right. Let's close this out. Actually, you know what? We're big kids. We're just going to throw a new project in here that has no relation to the other project. I'm sure it won't go wrong. Okay. Let's look at API, and specifically minimal API. So ASP.NET Core Web API, or just API. All right, hit next, and we're going to choose API app. And then we have these options, and there's a few other options to look at. So we have configure for HTTPS, yes. .NET 7, yes. Down here, we have use controllers, which is the original way of doing API. So if you're familiar with the controller method setup, it looks very similar to MVC, but it's just your controllers, that's your API. If you uncheck this, you get minimal APIs. Minimal APIs were designed to be something you get up and running very quickly, like a web service. So if you're doing microservices, for example, and you want to create a very small API, I think I have a demo on YouTube where it's like 50 lines of code total. It has full CRUD access to a database with an API. 50 lines. So you can put that in one file, easy to debug, easy to maintain, and there's not a lot of stuff going on all over. We're going to use minimal APIs. And yes. Yeah. Yep. It's all still there. It's just a different way of doing it. They had problems in the beginning with unit testing because they were they didn't have a full set of equivalencies. They do now. Yes, you can unit test it. Yeah, I'm not gonna do it today. But yeah. The other thing is this is a .NET thing. .NET from .NET Core and on, and that is Open API supports, which this is awesome. It's again a community standard. It used to be called Swagger. Now it's called Open API because let's change names. But what this is a way of documenting your API that allows your users to actually use your API, test your API, know how your API works, how it functions, and again, who's great at documentation here? Okay, awesome. I'm gonna hire somebody. But because we're not great at documentation, this allows us the first step automatically, and that is Open API. We hit create, and I think you're gonna love this API. Let's set it as a startup project, and let's look at Program.cs. And by the way, we have 44 lines of code. This is the entire API. There is no other code files anywhere. Okay, so you have app settings.json, but that's it. So this is our entire project, and if I were to run this, notice there's also comments in here. This also has some sample stuff from Microsoft in here. So if we just run this, this will give us a working API. It's a demo, but that's complete. That's goody, goody, goody. Yep, awesome. This should work. So the fact that it doesn't is spectacular. We'll try a rebuild. Rebuild does a clean first, I don't know if you know, but it cleans everything out and starts over. And it looks like it's, oh, I'm not connected to the internet. Let's connect to the internet so we can get NuGet package. How about that? What's the student? Okay. Is it cap? Oh, it's capital I. All right. So student. Try this again. If not, I can tether. So in this file, though, hey, there we go. Let's try a rebuild again. There we go. Restore. Okay. Now we can run this. In this file, we have an API that's fully functioning, and this is our Swagger or Open API documentation. So by default, I don't know why you're trying to go there, but by default, it's going to take you to the /Swagger endpoint. We can look at that in a little bit. But what it does is we have one endpoint in this application that is the /forecast. You open it up, you can actually see an example of what it would give us. So this is what's going to return, this kind of data. And if you want, whoops, there we go. You can come up here and say, try it out, execute. And it says, hey, I've got a 200 response, and here is the data. So I've just called this API, and I've gotten the data back in a test type environment right in the browser. Now, this does not replace Postman, but it does make your life a whole lot easier, and you don't have to use it all the time. So this is Swagger. This is built into new APIs, and that's right here. So if we're in development, by default, Microsoft says, hey, you might not want to do Swagger all the time. Maybe you don't want to show it off in production. So secure by default, Microsoft says, well, we're only going to run it in development. Excuse me, in development. But if you want to run it all the time, just take this out of the if statement and just run it all the time. So that's all it takes to configure Swagger besides adding it to dependency injection. But again, create builder, dependency injection, use Swagger, HTTPS redirection, Microsoft stuff, and one mapping. So let's cut this down to just what we need. So, yep, this works, but really we don't need to have Swagger. We don't want Swagger. We can get rid of it just for fun. Oh, before we do, let's just create one more endpoint. app.map.get, and we're going to say /hello, and then here we're going to say our arrow, and we'll just say return hello world. All right. So we need our semicolons here and here. Okay. With that, I've now created another endpoint. Let's, you know what? Did I close that? I closed it. So let's just restart it. I could have hot reloaded it, but there you go. It's now in Swagger. So it's already documented it. I picked it up. I can come in here. I can say try it out, execute, and I can get back hello world. So you don't have to do anything. It just works to have Swagger documentation. You can do stuff. You can do a lot of cool stuff, but you don't have to. Now, let's get to throwing stuff out. Let's get rid of Microsoft's default stuff for their sample stuff. So get rid of the map get right here. We'll get rid of their class here. They put in the same file, bad Microsoft. Let's get rid of the Swagger. Get rid of that. Let's get rid of the use Swagger. So we don't need to have this now. So we can actually say .build right here and call this app. And get rid of that line. And now we have 4 lines of code that actually have a functional API. So if we were to run this API, Swagger page doesn't exist. We can go to /hello and get hello world back. Okay? So with 4 lines of code, you can have an API up and running. Now, realistic? But we can get a few more lines. All we need to do is have these map get, map post, map put, map delete, and call out to our class library that has our data access or wherever else. And you're done. API written. Okay? Not a lot of stuff has to be done for an API. The point here that Microsoft was creating is we still have a full API. We still want to have the controllers and we still have all that ceremony, and it still works, and it still works for backward compatibility. However, we also have this ability to have a new way of doing things that allows us to have a very quick, small, compact little API for little purposes. So Microsoft is saying, not everybody does things the same way. Let's go ahead and allow you the option of doing either one, whichever works better for you. Okay? So that is minimal API. We're going to touch on a couple more real quick. I could go on all night, but I think you might want to go home at some point. So what's that? Okay. I've got all night. So if you want to keep going afterward, we can do that. But a couple more things to talk through real quick that I want to touch on. Let's stop this. Let's pull up, well, let's go into our counter page. We just have some code here. If we want to create a method that returned 2 values, how do we do that? Well, it used to be we create an out variable, okay, which they're messy, but they work. So for instance, an example of this would be if we had int.tryParse. We have, let's zoom in here if we can. We have our string we pass in to parse. We also have an out int result because they want to return Boolean, did it work or not? And then also the integer, what's the value? This is the old way of doing things. We have new ways of doing things. They're called tuples. How many of you have used tuples? Okay, good. So tuples are awesome. So if you want, you can do something like, let's return a tuple. String, now I have name mine. First name, string, last name. And then let's just say, let's call this get names from full name. yellow in there. Full name, and we'll pass in the full name. There we go. Okay, so this would be the example of using a tuple. What we can do is we can actually return two values. Now the benefit here, and we're inside of Blazor and it's not liking this. Oh, we're not returning a value. Okay, so no problem. We can return Tim and Corey. Here you go. Happy now? So what we can do is return multiple values. We can have as many values as you want in a tuple, not just two. Doesn't stand for tuple, not a threeple. It's just tuple. It means as many values as you want, and you can name them or not. You don't have to. So you could just say string, comma, string, and then value 1 and value 2. And we all know how wonderful it is to name your variables value 1 and value 2. It's the best. So personally, I recommend you actually name these. So string first name, string last name. This allows you to return two different values. It also allows you then when you say var test equals get names from full name or the pass in test. We're not actually processing that, but you can say test dot first name, test dot last name. You actually reference it based upon what the names are. You could also, this is kind of cool, you don't have to take them in as one value. You can actually name them. So we can say like this. And now it will put our FN is our first name, our LN is our last name. We can also use the discard character, which I'm not sure if you've seen or not, but that is the underscore, which says, I don't care. Okay, that's what discard means. So it's saying, I don't care about last name. I'm just caring about the first name. So therefore, why should I create a variable to hold this with extra memory usage for no purpose? Therefore, get rid of it. That way, someone later doesn't come along and use that accidentally. So therefore, we can discard it that way. So tuples, really cool stuff. There's some other stuff that's in here. One of the things that you maybe have not seen, let's just pull this one up real quick. And I'm going to create a class for this. Let's just call this person. Notice the template's not updated, so, or it's half updated. So, well, let's go up namespace. There you go. Let's put a semicolon at the end. So, if we want, we can create a prop and say string first name, prop, string, last name, right? Well, that's the way to do the class. We also now have the option of doing a record. Public record. Let's call this person record. String, first name, string, last name, like so. That's the same declaration, pretty much. Okay? So this is going to create behind the scenes for us properties for first name and last name. We can now access it person record dot first name, person record dot last name. The benefit here is there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on behind the scenes of a record. For instance, you can do value comparison. So you have Tim Corey as first name and last name. You can compare that against a different record, a different instance that has Tim Corey, and the two will be equivalent. You're doing a value comparison as opposed to what normally happens in classes, which is the location of that class is compared against the location of the other class, and those won't match. It also has the ability to say print. You can actually, or toString, it will actually print out first name colon Tim, last name colon Corey. So it's actually a much nicer mechanism there. It also works upon the principle of it is immutable. Now, you can mute them, whatever. You can make them, you can change them. You're not supposed to. It's supposed to be that a record does not change, which means you can rely on it to always be the same value over and over and over again. There are ways of getting around it, but again, that's what it's designed to do, which is why behind the scenes, it's not a get set. It is the equivalent of get init, which is a new way of doing things, which is that first name now has to be initialized with the constructor. So it's not going to be, it's not going to be changed later on. It's only changed during construction, okay? So records are hugely valuable for when you're bringing in data from a database, let's say, and you're just going to use it to read somewhere, much more efficient. But just to be clear, they are still classes. Behind the scenes, they're still a class. You pass it around, you're passing around the location of the class, you're not passing around the actual copy of it, and so on. But they're can be super helpful for a lot of different things inside your code. Okay? Lots more stuff in .NET 6 and 7, a lot of cool stuff, but I think I'm gonna leave you there. I'll leave some time for questions, and also I'll be around afterwards. So, questions? I did, didn't I? Good catch. Okay, I already got pulled up, so let's talk about it. So, in the Blazor app project, we see that we have Nullable enabled. This is a newer feature in .NET 6 and above, I believe. It's optional. You can turn it off. But what it's designed to do is every time you create a file new project, it's going to turn on by default. Applications, one of the big exception points is dealing with null. Like that's just the thing. And so Microsoft said, how can we make this better? Well, let's build into the tooling a way to check for if this could be null and make sure you're putting tests around null. And so if you have it nullable enabled, when you do things like we're doing here, which is I have a public string last name, but I don't assign it an initial value. Therefore, by default, it's null. But I have not marked this string as nullable. So because I have not declared it as nullable, it's saying, hey, there's a problem here because this is going to be null even though you don't expect it to be null. So what we do is we apply the, yes, this can be null, the question mark, onto it and it allows it to be nullable. And then later on, it will tell you, hey, you need to check to make sure it's not null when you use this. So what Microsoft is doing is just on the design side. Okay, it's not in product, it's not in the runtime, it's not making any change in your code, but it's giving you a whole lot of warnings saying, hey, this could be null, and you're not checking for it, or you're not intending for this to be null, but you're putting a null value in here. So it's trying to help protect you either way. And so, yes, you're going to decorate your code with question marks on strings, even though a string by default is nullable. But this way you can tell the compiler and the person reading, I expect this at some point to be null. Therefore, let's check for nullable. Absolutely, intentionality is a great word. Correct. So that's all C#. So it's all new .NET project. Yep. So you have to upgrade Entity Framework because Entity Framework does not understand the new date time. Or are you sure you're using date and time? Yes. That's the other thing here. There is different types here. We have just date only. By the way, yes, it says date only instead of date. There's an important reason for that because I think VB uses date, and they didn't want to step on the toes of VB, and so they said date only and time only. So just to be clear, why it's an only, they actually thought it through. They weren't just being stupid. But date only and time only didn't work in Entity Framework at first. It wasn't until it might even been .NET 7 before. But you have to update the NuGet packages for Entity Framework 2. So check that. Yep. So, or just don't use Entity Framework. But sorry, pet peeve. I know. All right. Other questions? Yes. So I appreciate the softball question because there's one place on the internet, 500 plus videos to help you out. I am Tim Corey. Yeah. So my website, I do that. So every time a new .NET comes out, a new version of .NET, I cover all the big stuff that you'd probably be using in a video and explain what it does and why it does and how it does it. So all this stuff I've covered today, it's all been in different videos broken out by what they do. So this is not a pitch seminar, so I'll pitch one thing and we'll move on. We'll forget I even say anything. I do have a C# master course, which is paid, it's not free, but it does start from I know nothing all the way through the end of C#, like I can be a developer, so that it fills in those gaps in order. Because that's the problem of learning. This is what I did. I learned my own, and I learned, okay, I got a piece over here and a piece over here and a piece over here, and I figured out how to make those work together, and then I just totally missed pieces. And then I go to a thing like this, and I'm like, I'm an idiot. Because everybody else is talking about this thing that they all know about, and I'm like, I've never heard of this thing, and now I don't know anything, which is not true. You just are doing different things. So Microsoft has, and again, I want to give them credit where credit's due. Microsoft has done a 180 when it comes to their documentation. If you grew up in the 90s or developed in the 90s, and you look at the documentation for something, what does console write line do? It writes to the console. Thanks, got it. Yeah, the MSDN documentation came on disks. That was awesome. No, but Microsoft Learn, go there. Microsoft Learn has a ton of great resources that will walk you through step by step a different scenario. And so, especially the new stuff, they try and get in there. They have good documentation in general. So if you say, what is time only, you can go learn, and it will tell you more than just it's only time. It will actually tell you what it does. It'll give you an example how it does it. The other cool thing is everything is in GitHub. So if you find a flaw or you want to add an example or think something more clear another way, you can actually create a pull request on a modification of that file, and they'll put it into their documentation. And now you've helped Microsoft make documentation better for everybody. So Learn's a great tool for going and finding kind of some of that stuff. But again, it's hard. It's hard to try and piecemeal together because the wave of changes never stops. Like I said, absolutely, and we're adding a 13th. The benefit is we get to do it however we want, and legacy works. The downside is there's 12 ways of doing it. So if I'm learning it, which way is the right way? Is it the 12th way, or is it, or what? So yeah. So there is a lot of change that happen over time. So yeah, either comprehensive learning from the ground up that covers your gaps, or try and keep up with every new .NET change as they come out, which is in November. Great. All right. I think I'll leave it there. But if you have any more questions, I'm still here. But I want to make sure I honor your time and make sure you can go home. So I'll see you next month. So.